can be a real complicated process to sell your company. And, you know, if I'm an entrepreneur and thinking about a liquidity event, where do you even start? Maybe Jennifer, when you're thinking about selling your company, where do you start? Where's the process start?
Yeah, I think for me, that started right from the beginning when we went looking for investors, because it's part of your strategy at the end of the day, right? And things change. You know, the IPO markets get hot and you decide to pursue IPO, or a lot of acquisitions are going on. But I think for my company here, I generally aligned with the investors because we had a choice of investors of who we brought in. And I wanted to make sure whoever we brought in was thinking about the world the same way my co-founder and I were. So really that started from the beginning. And then throughout the course of building out the company, there is, and we'll get sort of into the steps, but there's a lot of decisions you make every day with that in mind. You know, how you socialize the story, you know, whether you get audited financials or not, just sort of options for that. So I would say preparing for liquidity starts from the beginning with the corporate strategy, and it's something you revisit all along. And then when you have a value inflection point, you assess sort of the current environment.
Yeah, I know, Mark, you work with a lot of companies, like portfolio companies, and they're thinking about selling their companies. Where do you usually recommend that they start? Smaller companies.
Well, you're right, Steve. A lot of these companies are thinking about an exit, but if they're not, we are. We expect to be in our portfolio companies 3 to 5 years, and we want to know before we go in what the plan is. We've been stuck in a couple of deals, and where management just wants to keep kicking the can down the road. We really want them to focus early on where they want to take the company. What are they trying to build? Are they trying to build their net worth? Are they trying to build their legacy? Do they want to be a part of the company for the long term? What we want them to do is just stop and think. And where I think a lot of that thinking gets done, at least for me, is when I'm on vacation. Or when I'm on a trip and there's nobody to go to dinner with, and I'm just sitting there by myself. Just think about what do you want. And I've been involved in this in a number of different ways. I spent 15 years in investment, middle market investment banking, 15 years as a principal investor through our funds, and I've also sold our company in the past. And I wish I'd taken that time on a vacation before we sold it the first time. Sounds like you were much more successful than I was the first time. But it's, you know, where to begin? Right in the beginning. I think your comment, you know, before you even get the investors in, not every investor requires that. I think that's probably more common in earlier stage companies where they really want things laid out. In our core strategy in Mez, there's less of that planning, and it's a lesser part of the narrative. But we try to drive it and get people thinking about that early on, and come to a consensus on what we, the investor, and they, the owner of the company, want to do.
And Ani, you too, when you're going through this process, did you start at the same place Mark suggested with the strategy, try to put together a plan? 18-month plan to execute that strategy?
Yes and no. I think you know, for us, it was always situational. So depending on you know, what was happening at the time. So what I typically advise entrepreneurs is to always, before you know, right at the start of your company, figure out what it is that you want to do at exit. How do you want to exit the business? I think more and more you're seeing that, you know, the lifestyle entrepreneur is no longer there. I mean, they're getting extinct. You need to figure out what you want to do, how you want to get out of the business when you're getting into it. So for us, and even while it's not a very active, everyday effort, I think that what you do is once you figure it out and you know in the back of your mind, the way you interact with all of your stakeholders is very different. You know, your investors, your customers, your competitors, how you know, manage and meet, you know, those relationships and expectations are very different. So if you don't have it, and most people that I've seen, both, you know, when we're buying companies and even it's happened to us when we're selling, when you're not very clear about how you want to exit, it always takes you by surprise. And those surprises are usually not very good ones.
You know, you're lucky working for larger companies with lots of advisors and staff. Smaller companies probably don't have the staff and the resources on. Talk about advisors a little bit, and who are the right people that an entrepreneur should be reaching out to, and how do you identify those folks?
So I know advisors you should have talked to, and I can tell you those very clearly. I think depending on the size of the deal, I think everybody, no matter how small you are, should have an advisor advising you because they get the right value out for you. I believe that part of the planning initially, when you're starting the company, is actually building relationships with an advisor or a group of advisors that would come into your business, understand it, fully understand the value that you offer, and be able to market it when it's time to sell it. I've worked with I've had, again, the privilege of working with some advisors, some very small ones, and some very large ones. And I really like the ones that are very entrepreneurial in their thinking. So whether it's a big bank, the last deal we did at Triple Point involved, we had to actually hire 2 banks to represent us. So Barclays and Deutsche Bank. We did that very consciously because the deal we did prior, we had Credit Suisse. And it was a very good outcome, but it required a lot of pushing. And prior to that also, we had Credit Suisse that we retained to actually find a buyer, and they couldn't. So it was a waste of a 10 months period. So I think that advisor is important, but I also think that you cannot do without one. You must always get an advisor. If you don't, I think you end up paying for it. The little fee you pay them, the 5%, I mean, the bank's case, I think it's about 10% or whatever they ask, is worth it for the right advisor. But it's been a nightmare, working with the big banks, because typically when they're not entrepreneurially minded, what happens is they don't understand your business, they shoehorn it into all kinds of places, they get you into, they usually sell you on the big names. We're going to get you to SAP, we're going to get you to Salesforce, and they will get you to those people because they have, ins into the M&A department. But that's essentially it. It dries up very quickly, and then they run off on another deal. So be very careful as you choose it. I also think that, for smaller firms, accounting firms are good advisors. I think, both your accounting firms and your local, the councils and attorneys that you have locally, because they will also understand your business well enough to be able to represent you. And I think there are a couple of also very Connecticut-based local banks that, I'll put a plug in for. Carter Morse, I think they've done a lot of deals in the space in Connecticut and truly take the time to study the companies and understand them.
Yeah. Jennifer, your insights on advisors too, and your transactions.
Yeah, so we were a small company when we started, 2 of us. We're now about 15, but I don't think you can afford not to have really, if my team's going to be small, they're going to be good. Because when I'm in a room, I want to be able to hold my own. So I hired Wilmer Hale right back, who'd worked for me for 15 years, and I had a ton of banking relationships because I had sold companies, and those were some of my first meetings. They've been at the table with us the whole time. So I think when you're small, you can't afford not to have good advisors that you trust, because I agree with you in the end. There's a lot of money in play, and you want to make sure that if you're right and you get it right, that you're able to sort of capitalize on that. So no, we use a lot of advisors, and I've got long-time relationships, so it was easy to go back to what I do.
That's great. And Mark, you've been working with a lot of portfolio companies. You're one of those advisors, I assume, helping them through the process.
No, we're the investor, and we try to be the advisor, and sometimes we are the advisor. But one of the things that we often, almost always suggest that our portfolio company CEOs do is start thinking about the iBank or the M&A firm that you want to represent you, but start first with a closer circle of advisors. Accounting firms, if you trust your accounting firm and they've given you good advice in the past, they would be a good one. But friends, mentors, use them as a sounding board as you're trying to figure out what you really want. And then that leads to starting to line up the formal advisors that you bring in. Run the search, meet a handful of iBankers and M&A firms, get to know them, get them to hear your story, find out who resonates best with your story and who you resonate best with. Take the time rather than finding yourself in a situation where somebody's making an offer and you've got to hurry up and pick somebody. Make it a slow dance, take the time. And you know, the recurring theme with me is start early, take it slow, think it through, plan it out, surround yourself with the people so that when that event comes about, whether you initiated that event or somebody else initiated that event, you're ready to go. You know where you're going to turn to first. You've got a plan. You've got a strategy. You know how you're going to. You know what the story is. Your whole team knows what the story is, and it's tight and it works and it goes through the way you like.
I'll also add something to that, is because I think for smaller firms, what happens is you think spending time with advisors earlier on is sort of a waste of time. I'd rather spend it on sales than spend it on marketing and all of that. But I do believe that you end up leaving a lot of money on the table. I've bought companies that didn't have advisors. I've bought companies that had. And the difference in value is night and day. Because for the good advisor, you get paid fairly well. So I do think it's time worth investing early enough into the process and very clearly so you're not rushing through it.
Yeah, and so how do you find these advisors? Everybody's in agreement that it's critical to have the right advisor.
If I could just make one comment on Ani's comment. A lot of our companies make acquisitions. Most of them are making acquisitions along the way, and it's fascinating to see a target company that you're going after that may have initiated the process themselves. They're not prepared, and it's not fair. They leave so much money on the table. We get a far better deal. We in our portfolio company. And it's just so obvious when somebody doesn't have a plan, and they're babes in the woods.
Right. So how do we find these advisors? What's the best way to find, identify, and how do I make sure I've got the right fit?
Well, don't take time away from sales and marketing, but integrate it into the process. If you're in New York and you've got some meetings there, or up in Boston, find a couple of advisors, have breakfast with one, have lunch with another, and like I was saying, that resonation. Who resonates with you? Who's resonating well with your story? And take the time, but don't lose out on marketing time.
Yeah, definitely not. But I think the key though is making the time, and I don't think you have to, frankly, go to New York. I think you can get it locally. I also believe that these advisors don't have to be investment bankers. They could be, analysts anywhere. They could be people that that have good financial, experience that have done stuff before like that. They could be consulting, firms. And like I said before, it should be your accountants, because if you trust them enough to do this, they should be able to help you also through that.
I agree. No, that's good advice. So we talked about the advisors. We're starting the process. What else should companies be focused on? We're building a strategy out, but what else should they be doing to prepare the company for a sale? Jen?
Yeah, I think first of all, getting lockstep with your board on the strategy is really important, because I think when you're out talking to people or doing anything, you want to make sure you're just in line with your board and where the company's heading. I think once you agree on strategy, it makes all of our jobs a lot easier to make decisions. So if I know the strategy ultimately is to sell the company or IPO, when we're picking auditors or whatever, it's easier to make those decisions. So yeah, I just think to get prepared, it's knowing what you're being really clear with your board, what your strategy is, and then making decisions that support that all along the way. And then revisiting it, obviously things change and you have to circle back on it, and that's okay. I just want to add one more thing too, because I think for me, and I've learned this along the way, the hard way, the most important thing, and when I started this company I wanted, was a board of directors that I respected, I trusted, I thought were aligned with my co-founder and my values, because for a CEO, that's everything. That's your group, and I think keeping them informed and making sure they understand the things you're wrestling with and getting their skin in the game too. for me, has just made life really pleasant because I feel like they're aligned, they know why we made decisions. If I'm wrestling with something, I circle in. So I think one of the best things you can do in the beginning is getting a good board and getting aligned with them on strategy. I feel after that, it's all about execution. And then, creating liquidity is easy if you've got all those pieces in line.
So just along those lines, I think the board is one section of that team. I think the second piece, layer to that cake is a very solid management team. I can tell you in all honesty, every success I've had has come from a very strong base that is the team. I think you hear investors say it all the time when they come to invest. If you don't have a team, it sounds almost crass, but I can tell you, if you have the right team that can travel, frankly, that is portable, that a company sees as assets. In my case, because we're software development, the team, IP is essentially people. IP is, who is smart and who can, go the distance. And I think when we buy a company, it is probably at the top of our list on who is coming over with that acquisition. If you don't have the right team, I think you'll be struggling. Second, also, I'd like to add, and not just because I have a finance background, but I do believe that when you sell a company, make sure that your finance group is solid. So it is not just hiring the right people and, or hiring, very hiring people, but hire people that can get your books ready, get it showable, and get it looking good for an investor coming in or for a buyer, a strategic buyer. It presents the company much better than anything else that I think you can. I mean, they get through that, they can get through technology, they can get through all the other pieces. But when they come in, everything else could be fine. Once they look at the financials and it's, shoddily kept, there's, trepidation. They start to, retrace their steps. And I think eventually might pay you less because they feel that this is not a tightly run ship. So as quickly as you can do it, and again, it's another expense, make sure that you get your finance house in order before you start to do it.
And one of the first things we do in most of our portfolio companies, is, even before we invest, is we look at the financial function and the strength of the financial function. And probably the most common requirement that we'll place on a company, because all of our companies are looking they're pursuing some sort of growth strategy. We want to make sure that financial function can support them. So one of the most common recommendations that we make, and before we invest, it's not just a recommendation, it's a requirement. We want to see something stronger than a controller in there. We want a CFO, somebody who can pop their head up, be a strategic thinker who's been through it before. Because we've seen more deals, and we've been on both sides of this, fall apart because of the inability to produce good, believable numbers. You can blow your credibility quickly without having good numbers. And also, not just the basic numbers, but the ability to respond quickly when there are questions. When somebody wants to see some bizarre sort of report because it's really critical to them, make sure you got the team that you can do that. Nothing builds confidence than somebody coming up with a question and you've got an answer. What we try to do is try to anticipate questions and have written answers for a lot of things. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out the things that most investors are going to be looking for. Take the time to sit around and what would you be looking at? What are the things that you'd want to see? Reduce those to writing and then come up with narratives. There's nothing better. It's such a power thing. When somebody asks you some question and you reach into your briefcase and you've got a written response for them and you talk about it, it's off the table. The longer you take to respond, the longer your financial people take to produce information, the more time they've got to think and reconsider whether they really like you as much as they thought they did.
And so recently we had a client, the deal fell through. It was a large deal and it fell through during the due diligence process. And for similar reasons that you're pointing out. Jennifer, do you recommend almost like a pre-due diligence readiness type reviews, or have you done that in the past?
You mean when someone's coming in to look at us?
Before, right, get ready for that due diligence review?
No, I mean, I've never used that, but again, I've had Ernst & Young auditing. I mean, we've met a lot of those requirements along the way. I pay attention along the way and I always have in mind the end game that if this is gonna get sold, we need to have a data room that I can produce. So we do a lot of that planning ahead. We have a cloud set up. When they set up file structures, we were logical about it. We made sure everything's in there. So again, from the very beginning, we always had the eye on where we ultimately need to be. So I've never used a diligence ready thing because I think that's part of, my controller, myself, we think about that all the time. We need to be diligence ready, so.
So one thing also that I've sort of instituted is, given that we did, just in about a space of 3 years, did $125 million dividend recap, that essentially had borrowed money to pay that. Did a transaction for $560 million to sell the part of the company, and then 18 months later sold the company again for $925 million. To do that, you have to be super ready. So what I actually institute now is you have to be ready within 30 days for an eventuality, for a transaction, for any financing, for anything at all. So it takes you 30 days to get super ready, get the data room ready, and then be ready to go. I think if you're that ready, if you're that prepared, and I think it's important, just the comments earlier, that when they ask you the question, can we get this? And you say, yep, we already got that. We already got this, by the way. I think it changes the discussion. It changes the tenor of the conversation. So I think it's important, again, to invest in that area. And as I know, the reason I sort of stress on it is these are areas where smaller companies are found wanting because they haven't really thought about it, thought through enough to get to that point.
What are some of those details, Mark, that, building on what Ani's saying, be ready, be prepared, have the reports. What are some of the things, some of those details that you know that companies would have to prepare?
We'll get down to a pretty granular level. I was sitting here thinking how fortunate Jennifer is because she was able to start her company, and I think this is probably the case for a lot of folks in the room, from whole cloth. You're starting it from the beginning. In our companies, they tend to be much more mature, and there's a lot of legacy stuff there, and some of that legacy is good and some of it's bad. What we want to do when we're doing due diligence, and also when companies are getting prepared for a liquidity event, we want them to really take a deep dive into all the details, get down to granular, very granular level. Look at the employment agreements, look at the your supply agreements, and try to identify anything that's going to be a stumbling block once you get out into the market. You don't want to get hung up over employment agreements that are really out of sync with the market and place restrictions on an acquirer. But just think of all the little things and again, get down to that granular level and just be prepared.
I can add to that quickly. So I mentioned that the team is important as you build a company. I also think it's important just building, on the conversation so far, that you take care of the team. So when a company is into value, it's not the time to start to get the employment agreement ready. I think you should have figured out who should be getting what in that process and make sure that they are well compensated. I think one of the things that gave me a lot of joy through many of the transactions that I've done, especially the 3 that we did at Triple Point, was sort of the number of people that we made happy. And the way that happened, and I think if you ask me what was the happiest that I was there, was these are developers that you give stock options, and they just take it and throw it under the pillow, wherever they sleep, which could be their desk. But when the time came and these deals are done, and you show them what they're making, grown men were crying, and grown women too, because they never really believed that was, this was outsized, call it outsized, a transaction, the size, But people were literally in tears. They would come into my office and say, I never knew that this was going to come. But it's taking care of those people that you think are critical to that success. And I think you have to do that also well ahead of a transaction, or well ahead of somebody coming to knock on your door.
That's good advice. Jennifer, I see you shaking your head. Is that a strategy that you also employ at your companies?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a big believer in that. I think everybody needs to be aligned, the management team, and we give stock to every single employee. And I had that experience as well when we sold the last company. You make a big difference in people's lives when they get a nice check at the end. And so for my companies, I'm always really clear when I'm hiring people, here's the time frame. This may be a 3-year run, but you're going to own part of it with me, and we're actually coming up on that. It's fun. We are going to have data later this month, and I've got employees all over, and they all want to be in the office when the card gets turned over because they're all owners of the company, and they really feel that. I mean, they all the time are beating on things, and I'll tell people, relax. They said, I own part of this company. I'm not going to let them waste my money. So I think that's one of the most valuable things that tech companies have at their disposal, and it's good when I think management and the board isn't greedy about that and sort of shares it broadly. So I love that aspect of it.
In public companies, I guess it's easy to share financial information because it's out there for everybody to see. But I know, Marc, you work with private companies, and Ani, your private company currently. I mean, how much do you share with your employees as far as financial statements?
Almost everything. Anything that they want to see. About the only thing we don't want that's particularly sensitive are salaries and bonuses. But somebody always seems to leave one of those in the copier and it gets out anyways. No, I think, in our own company, in our portfolio companies, we want to create a sense of openness. We want people to understand how this company runs. So many people can kind of get in their own box and not really figure out how their actions affect other things within the company. You want them to understand that, and by providing them more information and encouraging people to talk openly, they start seeing their place in the machine, and they know that they're an important cog in the wheel. And I think they don't need as much information as they sometimes ask for, but we think it's better to provide more than less, and just be open. And it shouldn't be any big secrets.
I just want to add one thing too. I think one of the responsibilities as a CEO, at least in a company like this, where you're sharing ownership, you've set an aggressive vision, you're being very open with your information. Not everybody is set up for that. Some people do much better in big companies where there's a defined job and they're not juggling 9 million things. And the one thing I've had to sort of learn along the way is not everyone's cut out for that world, and if they're not cut out, you probably need to cut bait soon, because in a small team that's really highly focused on sort of the end game and incentive for that, when you get a couple outliers of that, it's very distracting, and it can really pull down sort of what you're trying to create. And so I have learned that I just need to cut bait quickly, treat them right on the way out, but I don't carry people like that. We don't have the capacity. We're too small, too focused, too energized. So
yeah, it's surprising sometimes when you're driving your company, you've got a plan, you're pursuing it, and you just start thinking everybody else is on board, and you find out that you've got a couple of people who are key to the organization. They think the status quo is the coolest thing in the world. They don't want to see it change. They don't want, and we got to figure out, well, is this guy a keeper? Do we put him somewhere else, or do we cut and move on? But those are things that are easy to overlook. One thing that we haven't talked about, and one thing that we try to get our portfolio companies, that we insist that our portfolio companies do this, is to our companies don't go public. They're going to be sold to a strategic or to another financial, and we want them to think about who's the market out there for their company, who are they going to buy, who's going to buy them. Put together a spreadsheet. Meet these people, get to understand them and what their aspirations are, how their organizations work, what their culture is like, because you might end up being a part of it. Or you may want to take them off the list and make sure you don't end up a part of them. So we typically have a spreadsheet that we look at every board meeting. Who have you met? Who have you gotten further into this organization to, it could be a supplier, it could be a customer, could be a fund. And so that's another part of planning ahead, just so you can predict with a high degree of certainty who's going to be lucky or who's going to make you lucky, where you fit in and where you don't fit in. And it starts playing into, do I want to be in this company after we sell it or not? You know, is it legacy? Is it net worth? What am I playing for? And where do I maximize that with each of the people on the spreadsheet?
And so when do you suggest companies start doing that, start looking around? I guess initially, right away, even if I'm thinking about selling my company, or right away? I think those...
You got to have that vision of where you want to take the company, what that ideal exit looks like, and that becomes kind of your stake in the ground. Now that you're going to be moving that stake around a little bit over time, but that becomes the thing against which you measure everything. And you measure your efforts. Are everything you did that day, was it taking you in that direction? And then when you do get those proposals in, now you've got something to compare them to. If you haven't thought ahead, it's all kind of abstract. Well, this seems like a good deal. Well, this seems like a good deal for this reason. But you want to have that stake in the ground against which you can measure everything.
Yeah, I mean, let's pick up on that at the end. So you start getting proposals and you start negotiating transaction pricing and things like that. Tell us about that process and what's important for an owner to keep in mind during negotiations.
Other than it's hell, and you should avoid it. So I think just on the negotiations and all of that, I think before you even do that, if you have an offer come to you, at a minimum, just like you would if you went to a doctor and they said, you have a problem, and it's a serious problem, you should get a second opinion. So at a minimum, go and get somebody else to validate that offer. It starts to give you sort of a benchmark on where they think or what they think that value should be. Most times, actually, people have no idea what their company is worth. Because you could look at it financially and just say, well, it's a multiple of revenue or multiple of EBITDA, and it still doesn't quite get you anywhere. Because somebody looks at it and discounts it, or somebody looks at it and then decides I want to pay a premium. So go to the people, the list that you've already prepared, go to all of them and approach them and say, well, we have an inbound for, are you interested? At a minimum, again, it gives you an idea, or it creates some competition. So I think that is step one. At a minimum, get that second opinion. And as far as the negotiations, that's where you start to reach out to your advisors. Everybody has a different view of value. It is, as clear as day that, there's no way that somebody's going to say, here's what I'm going to pay you, and you say, yep, that's exactly it. It doesn't happen, and especially in selling a company, because there's so many things tied into it, where if it's a small company, it's a founder-owned company, there are emotions tied into it that, sometimes they're not even prepared to sell, and you're telling them, all these stories about how life is going to be much better on the other side, and they still are not. Whatever money you throw at it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, the story comes to mind where we were in London negotiating a deal with a Swiss-based company that we're going to acquire. Two partners had started it. One based in Switzerland, in Geneva, just outside of Geneva, and then the other one based in Stellenbosch, in South Africa. And the company was headquartered in Geneva. And we had already agreed. So London was more just to sign the LOI and start the discussions. But much of the discussions had happened with whom I had considered the senior partner, because he owned more of the shares. And it was the worst conversation I've ever had with a company I was trying to acquire, because the whole 2 hours was this guy in Geneva yelling at the top of his lungs about how he could never sell this company, and how, and I thought they had talked about this. So it is important to get that, figured out, first of all, before you start to talk about the value equation. But it'll be it's always a very difficult, very contentious issue.
I have maybe just a little different view, and it might be the timelines in biotech. They're a lot longer, I think, than some of the tech businesses. I think I mentioned from the beginning, I think you have to have a strategy around the exit, but I do think there's a time, deals are all about momentum, and I think some companies go for too long, trying to be out there and touching people and telling stories, and people get tired of seeing you. And so I think, like in our business, we spent some time just validating the science, making progress, starting to get to know people. And then when we got into this point where we're in sort of these key trials, we started an effort about a year ahead to really make sure our targeted list knew who we were, they knew what our deliverables were, they could see that we were making progress. And then people start coming back to you wanting to sign CDAs and jump the process, and we've really held people off because you want to create this sense of, we're not in a hurry, we're just keeping you in the loop. Because I just think in deals, if you try to string them out too long and be too prepared and ahead of the game, you lose some of that sort of sex appeal of, wow, this is hot, I need to get into it. So there is definitely a timing thing, and I think some companies try to play PR games for too long or promise things or make hype that isn't there. I think the best thing you can do is sort of validate your technology, your science, and then be really clear to people, here's the path to value, and here's my timeline, and you decide when you want to join the fray. And so I think being really clear about that timeline is important.
Yeah, to be clear, when I suggested the spreadsheet and getting out and meeting people, you're not flogging the company. You're going out and meeting people. You're gathering market intelligence. You're getting to know people. You're not talking about an exit. You're doing exactly what you talked about. Running your business, achieving what you want to achieve, but you just want to develop a rapport and get that market intelligence, that cultural intelligence, so that you're a little bit better prepared. No, I think you're completely right. Once you make that decision to go into the market, you're going, and you've got to build that momentum. You've got to control the process and drive the process, but you don't want to string it out. I mean, anything that gets strung out starts smelling bad after a while, and not very long.
I assume a lot of the folks in the audience are emotionally attached to their companies. They've been, working 60 plus hours a week, a long time, building value, getting the company ready for sale. How do you let go? How do you let go of that and move on?
Well, I'm going to Jennifer to answer because she's, well, my role typically is, I am not the entrepreneur. I'm the guy that comes and helps the entrepreneur realize value, from the deal. Typically, I work with investors. They could be VCs or bulge bracket PEs. Make the investments. Sometimes I'll make the investments with them. Sometimes I'll just come along and then do it. So a lot of what I see from the other side, especially on the buy side, is I see a lot of entrepreneurs that are not prepared because they're not prepared. They just don't want. They can't. And I've gotten to, just having done enough of them now, I know how the sale process works, where I can sell it to them in a way that makes perfect sense, and also manage it after the fact. When it's done, making sure that the integration doesn't leave them behind. Most entrepreneurs want to be part of it going forward. What you can guarantee is that things will change for them. There's no way it's going to be the same at all. In fact, if anything, it won't resemble anything that they thought they were doing before. But you have to slowly let them know that. And also let them know that you're getting money, right? You're de-risking your whole investment and profile because you got money, so you can't now be. The guy I talked about before, the example I gave that I was yelling in London, we ended up buying the company. It ended up being actually a very good investment for us, but he still ended up being extremely miserable and stayed on even after we sold Triple Point. So he still stayed on. But these people would be, some people will choose to be miserable, some people will choose not to be. But if you are selling, the final thing is that if you're selling your company, if you're getting money for it, I think you should just know that an investor is paying money to not deal with sort of your issues. You have to just acknowledge that and then move on. But also know that things will never be the same. I think it's a very, very honest truth.
Yeah, I would say too, it's not hard for me, and part of that's getting older. The first company I grew up in, it was harder because you're very wrapped around it. But at this point, you know, I'm clearly financially incented if it sells, so that's a nice trigger point. I think also by this point, I know what I do well. There's a point in time where you grow the company too, and then it's probably time for somebody else to take it and market it, or, you know, biotech grows into big pharma eventually if you're successful. So knowing sort of where your boundaries are, and again, just being clear with everybody you hire. Here's the time frame. Here's what we're here to do. So I don't find that as hard. As a matter of fact, I'm already starting to think about, gee, where am I going next? Because if I have money, then I can do this or this. And it's actually funny. We were sitting in a meeting, and this company that's interested in us had said, well, I want the two of you to come along, the co-founder and I. And we both walked out, we're like, just give us a check. You know, we have no, you know, so people believe that management never wants to leave, but I don't know. I feel like entrepreneurs maybe understand from the beginning that's the end game. I don't feel that, I'm fine with
But
it.
that could be Jennifer though, because I think that much of what I've seen is the opposite, frankly. And I think though that the companies, the startups that end up succeeding, are the ones that recognize that at some point I need to just get somebody in here to help me, be it a financial investor, be it, you know, experience management, to just get into that next level. But I do see sadly the opposite, where people just cling on and then insist on being the one that, being the Larry Ellison, and then you know, most times it really works out that way.
We've seen many companies, and again, in our core strategy, there's a lot of manufacturing, distribution companies, kind of plain vanilla sorts of companies, where they'll sell the company, they'll think that they want to exit, and they get all excited about the money, and 6 months later, they've never been more unhappy in their entire life. They realized that business was the cornerstone of their existence. It was their social, life. So one of the things that we do, this doesn't make some of the investment bankers on the other side happy. When a company is getting ready to sell, an entrepreneur is getting ready to sell, we'll talk with them. Just have a drink with the guy and say, well, what are you going to do? What's your plan? And if they don't really have a plan, there's probably been 5 or 6 situations where we've convinced, not convinced, but caused the entrepreneur, the business owner, to rethink why he's doing what he's doing, and instead of completing a sale of the company, what they'll do is a partial recap, take some money off the table, bring in some additional growth capital, and take it for another 3 to 5 years, and have a bigger, better exit then. But it's not just about the money; it's kind of that gap. I mean, you're 55 years old, you're 52 years old, you don't have a lot of outside interest because you've been working 70 and 80 hours a week. What are you going to do? Yeah, it's probably been 5, maybe 6 times where companies have just gone to the banker and said, I'm not selling. Let's just bring in some growth capital and you know, let's run it for a while. But you know, I think it's important to talk with these guys and get them. It's not just money. They've got to think these things through. We have one guy. We run a lot of educational panels for middle market companies in secondary and tertiary cities. Like I spent time in Jackson, Mississippi, and Council Bluffs, Iowa, talking with business owners. And we always try to find that one guy that is the 55-year-old guy that his dad's 80, he's founded the firm, and we want him on the panel talking about his experience. And it's fun to look out into the audience, because about half the people in the audience, by the time this guy is halfway through his talk about how unhappy he is, half the audience is on the edge of their seat. And if you could put a dialogue bubble above their head, it would say something like, "Oh my God, that's me. I need a plan. I got to think this through." It's just a fascinating situation. I had a minor in psychology in college. I use that more than any of the economics or the finance. Just getting inside people's heads and helping them, pardon me, realize what they really want. Instead of it's not just a transaction. It's a big lifestyle change. For you, it's just money. I know.
No, I mean, I do just want to add, though, I think when you're a CEO and you take money from investors. Your job is shareholder value. So yeah, I may love what I do, I may love the company, I love my company, but my job is to create value for my shareholders above anything. And so if you're not in that mindset, you should not take money from outside investors. You should figure out how to do it yourself. You should run a family business. So I think CEOs have to sort of look in the mirror and understand what your role is in a company, and it is shareholder value.
Yeah, and as clinical as that sounds, that is the truth. You have, people sell their companies and expect things to be exactly the same way it was yesterday, and it never is. And then they're the ones that end up being, a little bit miserable about it. But,
well, that's a key distinction. Most of our companies are family-owned businesses, and there's just a lot more. There's a lot more generations. There's a lot more emotion involved, and we got to sort through it.
Maybe it makes sense to open it up the floor to questions from the audience. Go ahead.
Yeah, but just a question: how do you keep it confidential? I'm not saying like confidential between yourself and an advisor. This tends to leak, and if it leaks to your customer base, some could cut and run before you really have a concrete plan in place. So how do you keep that confidential?
so that's actually a very big risk that we run all the time, and I think that's probably, if you ask me, that's the biggest issue with many of these transactions. That it gets out to your customers before you're ready, it gets out to the competitors, leak it to the market, and get it going. And the way that we have always done it is initially just bring in a few people. So it has to be like you, the advisor, and maybe one or two of the management team, executive team folks. Keep it there, and then do all the work until you start to get a little bit more comfortable that there might be a deal. Introduce a couple more people into it, but it has to be very tightly managed because it could just become a blowout if it gets to the market. And most times, depending on how long the deal drags on, you can't keep it, under lead for a long time. So I think you just get the deal done as quickly as you can, but keep it amongst a tight group.
It's got to be on a need-to-know basis, and you shouldn't just assume that those people know not to talk about it to others. Make sure they understand explicitly that they're not supposed to talk about it at all. And then as you need to bring other people in, like financial people, get pledges of confidentiality from everybody. I don't mean a formal agreement. I don't think we've ever used one of those, but just make sure everybody knows that you can compromise the whole process if it gets out too soon.
There's also some advantage to you as a seller because what happens is you're then not giving out as much information as you ordinarily would if everybody was involved. So you can say, you know what, my controller, my CFO really isn't quite as involved in this and shouldn't know, so I can only give you X, Y, Z. And then you dribble information until you're sure they're not just kicking tires, and then you get one or two more people involved, and the whole process happens.
We have time for maybe one more question, and then we're going to wrap up. Is there anybody else who's got?
You mentioned that what you want to find is people that are really entrepreneurs. And so my question is, how do you find those people? Because candidly, I get calls all the time. It's usually some associate, a recent MBA that has a list of questions that they go through, and it's nothing about, synergy or potential. It's not entrepreneurial, it's process. So how do you find those people?
I'll start on it. You probably have your views too. Hiring in our businesses is probably one of the hardest things we do, I think, and it's a real crapshoot. You go through all the right questions, and I swear half the time you get it right and half the time you get it wrong. I feel like having interviewed for 20 years, you never really know till you get someone in-house, and it's not always obvious who is entrepreneurial or not, which is why I come back to you first make sure they're qualified. You try to ask the right questions, but if they get in-house and you made a mistake, I get out of it. So I have never found the formula to actually get the right people and never have to deal with them. It's hard. People know how to talk a good game, so I don't have good insight other than to deal with the mistakes you make.
Yeah, so what we do is make sure that at the hiring stage that we're doing the due diligence that's required. But again, it's a crapshoot. You could have people that you think are super, and then not. But more importantly, though, the culture is extremely important to success of any company. It sounds, again, trite. It sounds like, yeah, of course. But it is difficult to maintain as you grow the company. I think that if you have the right culture, the right entrepreneurial culture, what happens typically is these people come in. If they don't fit in, they would know. So it's a quick, mismatch immediately, and they don't like to leave, or you let them go. But I think if you do the right due diligence up front, and then have the culture that is welcoming to the entrepreneur, I think that they'll very quickly flush out the wheat from the chaff.
Okay, that's great. I want to thank you all. Appreciate you spending time and sharing your insights on this topic. Appreciate it, and I guess we'll move out and have a couple drinks at this point.